With the rise of ultra-Orthodox Islamic extremism, the message has always been clear, whether it was from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Afghanistan. American foreign policy is the enemy, not our basic freedoms. Over the years, that policy has changed, but our foreign policy has not. Islamic extremism today doesn't have that international threat that Al Qaeda once possessed. So, what made groups like Al Qaeda, Islamic State, to become so fervent against the West? Well, according to their theology or their version of religion, which is Wahhabi Islam, it's basically many sinful ideas. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is much more expansive, much more broad, much more threatening to their wish for a caliphate. It is United States, Great Britain, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, the Yahud, the Jews, and the United States, coalition partners. It is through our foreign policy, whether it be from the Democratic or Republican Party, makes no difference. The agenda is the same: to destabilize the Shia minority, destroy each country from within, to supplant the governments by using covert operations through the CIA, through the ISI, the Mukbarat, the Mr. Arvim in Israel, whatever it may be. The agenda is very clear: to subvert these Arab governments that don't cater to Western ideals or to the countries in the region that are aligned with United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, and to covertly usurp these governments from within. Usually takes time, but it works almost 100% of the time. We've seen this throughout the early 20th century. With the rise of pan-Arab nationalism, through its defeat in the Six-Day War, and the rise of the Islamic ultra-Orthodox Wahhabi ideology, with the help of the global intelligence apparatus. Whether it be bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Omar al-Baghdadi, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, or Ramzi Youssef, the suspect of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. You can hear it in their message to the media. A different message than that purported by Saeed Qutb or Hassan al-Banna, where they wanted to build a caliphate in the Arab countries, one by one, but not through inherent violence. That came later. With the rise of Egyptian Islamic fundamentalism through the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which saw the assassination of Anwar Sadat, the overthrow of Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, by the Iranian Revolution led by Khomeini, and al-Qurtubi in Saudi Arabia, who sees the kingdom as nothing more than a extension of the West, selling out their own country, with 1979 being the key period for the rise of Islamism. And from this point on, we don't just necessarily see the rise of Islamism. We also see a stronger bond between Israel, the United States, and then later Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's a tentative bond due to the fact that Saudi Arabia is quite aware that Israel's government is not too uh, keen on working with a Salafi led country. But Saudi Arabia wants to be the preeminent and only Arab force in the region. Their main enemy is the same enemy as Israel, and that is Iran. Saudi Arabia sees Iran as the enemy through theological differences. Israel sees Iran as basically a threat due to political reasons. And so the foreign policy of the United States is led by not just through the Pentagon and through the intelligence apparatuses or the State Department. It's also led by the lobbies inside the United States, mainly the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, which has a annual conference, as well as having other smaller Zionist organizations that work hand in hand with the Christian evangelicals, which is approximately 80 million Americans. Our foreign policy has been dictated through military expansionism, as outlined in the Project for a New American Century, through the Oded and Yanan Plan, which is Israeli policy and how to destabilize certain regions, how to work with certain regions, led by Arab governments that are Western backed, and of course, Arab governments that work with the kingdom in Saudi Arabia. And so here it is, the detriment of our foreign policy, which leads to extremist acts by Islamists. And it's not like these Islamists who want to facilitate large scale attacks, whether it be on US targets abroad and within the country, that the intelligence apparatuses aren't aware of what they're doing. Because the intelligence apparatuses, like the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, are quite aware of the expansive nature of these organizations. For example, in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the CIA and the FBI were monitoring the Al Farouk Mosque in Brooklyn, New York, which was right down the block from the Al Kifa Refugee Center, which was the main office for the Afghan Services Bureau in Pakistan, called the Maktab al Khidmat, which was uh, the recruiting station for Arabs, foreign Arabs, that wanted to fight against the Soviets and the communists in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1990 and also during the mid 90s. The intelligence apparatuses, led by certain elements of the State Department, started funding the Afghan Services Bureau and also independent Afghan leaders, tribal leaders, some of them receiving large sums of money through mainly the Pakistan ISI. because the United States didn't want to be caught funding these organizations, which would lead a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the United States would send arms and money through intermediaries to Pakistan through the Hindu Kush, which saw its way into elements of the ISI, which saw it go to tribal leaders such as Jalaluddin Haqqani, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Osama bin Laden himself was not a recipient of these monies coming from the CIA. He had money of his own and didn't want to receive money from the United States. The Arabs were very insular when it comes to foreign aid and didn't like NGOs coming into the country and trying to hijack the Afghan war against the Soviets. So they were quite aggressive toward them in Jalalabad, Pakistan. After the Soviet Union was defeated, the Islamists returned back to their countries, and we saw outbreaks of war, especially in the Balkans. 2 civil wars in Afghanistan, and of course, a growing threat which began under bin Laden and the Egyptian influences of Simon Saeed al Sharif, Dr. Fadl, and Ayman al Zawahiri, as well as Abu Ubaidah al Banshari, Mahmoud Salim, hardcore Egyptian Islamists who were affiliated with Gamma Islamiyah and most prominently from the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was the more extremist of the two. They persuaded bin Laden to fight against the global enemy, the far enemy, deemed the United States and Israel, whereas the near enemy was considered Arab governments, Egypt, Jordan, Syria. What came from the Islamists' retaliation from the West and overreaction from the West, especially after 9/11. For years, bin Laden had been trying to goad the Clinton administration to exert his full powers into Afghanistan, and he did not. Bush, led by the neoconservative factions, and of course, the more hawkish group called the Vulcans, led by Douglas Feith, Daniel Pipes, Richard Pearl, of course, Vice President Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, Paul Wolfowitz. These people helped outline many years in advance what the United States needs to do in order to exert its power in the Middle East region and Southeast Asia. Whereas even years before that, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote The Grand Chessboard, in which the United States needed to destabilize parts of the Middle East and to defeat the Soviet Union and become the global power. Brzezinski was not basically someone who adhered to Israeli foreign policy. He was on the Council of Foreign Relations, and basically saw American foreign policy far different than, say, Richard Pearl. Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, the real hardcore neocons got behind Paul Wolfowitz's doctrine, which later became the Bush doctrine, along with the Oded Yanan Plan, the Project for a New American Century, and then we start seeing the global military expansionism of the United States through its intelligence apparatuses, mainly the NSA and the CIA. With the NSA, it signals intelligence. And after 9/11, it got a blank check. And basically, the State Department, through its lawyer, John Yoo, who basically authored the torture program, which led to the capture of many innocent Afghans who were tortured mercilessly and gave them information that the CIA wanted to hear, because it was through the CIA that the State Department under Bush forced the CIA to find any connection between 9/11 and Iraq. So they facilitated information through torture. It's exactly what they did when they captured Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, and Abu Zubaydah, who were allegedly high-ranking members of Al-Qaeda. That wasn't the case with Abu Zubaydah. They found out that he wasn't the number 3 man in Al-Qaeda, even after years of torturing him, that he had no actionable intelligence. Meanwhile, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded approximately 183 times. Ramzi bin al-Shibh, I believe, 71. Lord knows what they told him. And according to the State Department, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed gave them a menu list of crimes that basically seemed impossible for one man to do. But whatever crimes that he's committed, which he is a murderer, it can no longer be used in a court of law, which is the reason why they went to Guantanamo in the first place, where he should have been prosecuted here in New York. Nevertheless, it was through the torture of Sheikh Ibn al-Libi in 2002 that he basically connected Iraq to al-Qaeda, suggesting that he saw the Iraqi Ba'athist Army working hand-to-hand with al-Qaeda sympathizers in creating chemical weapons. That information was used in Secretary of State Colin Powell's testimony before United Nations Security Council, and we went to war with Iraq. However, Sheikh al-Liman's testimony was false, and years later it came out that he told them anything to stop the torture. The United States basically lied in order to connect al-Qaeda and Iraq. We saw that with the anthrax letters, trying to say that the anthrax came from Afghanistan, and it didn't. It came from the Ames, which was the Ames strain in Ames, Iowa. The FBI destroyed the whole database. Well, not the FBI, but the database was destroyed, and the FBI couldn't investigate further about who sent the letters to Dan Rather, to Senator Leahy, and Tom Daschle. Leahy and Daschle were against the war proposition by Bush, so some irony there. But you can see where our foreign policy is coming from. It's coming from basically the Pentagon, State Department, working hand in hand, along with the Saudi Kingdom and the Likud Party, the Zionist organization led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And this goes back decades. But more prominently, from the mid 1990s to the present time, we see AIPAC becoming more of a force and more of an influence to our Democratic and Republican congressmen and women who basically are afraid to come out and oppose this agency. In the same regards as to that, the reason why we don't depose Saudi Arabia as a foreign enemy. Allegedly, 16 of the 19 hijackers 15 of the 19 come from Saudi Arabia, most of them the muscle hijackers, and allegedly one of the pilots, Hani Hanjour. Why aren't we going to war with Saudi Arabia instead of Iraq? Afghanistan, we went to war because basically bin Laden's training camps were allegedly operational, but before 9/11, those training camps were not. They were destroyed when we invaded Afghanistan, and Afghanistan still to this day is the longest war in American history 21 years. So, as you could see, that it's our detrimental foreign policy which leads to a reaction by those in which the intelligence apparatuses are monitoring already. In the case of September 11, 2001, it was the NSA who was monitoring Osama bin Laden's satellite phone from 1992 to 1998. And the Al Qaeda communications hub, which is located in Sana'a, Yemen, from 1996 to 2002. The CIA also was monitoring the Yemen hub from 1998 to 2001. In 1993, it was the Israeli Mossad who were keeping close tabs on some of the participants of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. A landlord by the name of Josie Hadass, whose name and phone number were on the application for the Ryder truck that was used for the bombing, that was referenced by one of the suspects, Mohammed Salome. The FBI tried to investigate this issue but kept it under wraps. Josie Hadass went back to Israel. In the case of September 11th, we have the Israeli Mossad working in moving companies in New York, New Jersey, and Florida, as well as the Israeli art student ring, which were monitoring the intelligence agencies of the United States, mainly the DA and the FBI. Monitoring the Hamburg cell, which is Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehhi, Ziad Jarrah, in New York, New Jersey, and Florida. The Saudis, GID, the intelligence wing, the General Intelligence Directorate, monitoring Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi in California, even monetarily assisting them, which came from Riggs Bank through an account by Haifa bin Faisal, the wife of former U.S. Saudi ambassador Bandar bin Sultan. All these intelligence agencies monitoring these large terrorist cells. Then you had operations like Able Danger, which were collecting metadata, public metadata on the cells. Found there were two, one led by Omar Abdel Rahman and Mohammed Atta. And they tried to share this information. It was ordered destroyed by the Department of Defense and U.S. Army lawyers who were acting in accordance with the Department of Defense, suggesting that Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehhi, and Ziad Jarrah are U.S. citizens. Came out later in 2005 by the Senate Judiciary Committee investigating the matter of one of Able Danger's intelligence operatives, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer, who was restricted from acting on his own accord because he shared the Able Danger program to 9/11 Commission Director Philip Zelikow, who didn't use the information anyway. And so the intelligence agencies monitoring these groups for years and years monitoring these groups and basically controlling their movements or closely watching their movements instead of stopping them before those events even happened, which goads a reaction from the United States. In that we can now invade countries on behalf of the terrorists' actions against the United States and the West and its interests, whether it be here or abroad. None more glaring example than what we're seeing in the last 15 years with the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, the bombing and invasion of Syria, the bombing and invasion of Libya, deposing these governments. We failed in Syria, successful in Libya, the bombings of Yemen, the bombings of Pakistan through drone strikes, killing tens of thousands. No more needing of FISA warrants, no more needing of warrants to collect metadata all around the world because of the events of September 11th. The NSA and the Five Eyes, which are the five countries' largest intelligence, signals intelligence agencies in the world, who collect metadata not just on their own citizens, but to uh, foreign citizens. And they act as one. The Five Eyes being Australia, Canada, the United States, United Kingdom, and New Zealand. Now it's 30 countries, all acting as one unit, sharing information together. You see the problem? Our foreign policy is the reason for most of the ills that we see in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. These terrorist networks don't need to exist, but they exist for a reason. They exist to usurp their own governments in hopes of creating a caliphate within those countries and also to defeat Western and Israeli influence from these Arab governments. Because it's through Western and Israeli influence, as well as Saudi influence, that causes a lot of the discord within the Middle East. Iran is not an enemy. Neither was Libya. Neither was Syria. Neither was Iraq. And neither was Afghanistan. The Taliban wasn't an enemy. They were not threatening the United States. Only Al Qaeda was doing that. And the Taliban didn't really want bin Laden in the country. But they weren't ready to throw him out and hand him over to Great Britain, which is what the United States wanted. The Taliban refused, saying that to hand over a Muslim to a secular country would be a sin in the eyes of the Islamic Ummah. Bin Laden could have been assassinated as early as 1993 while he was in the Sudan by the CIA. But they couldn't get the authorization. They could have assassinated him in Tora Bora in 2002, led by the Operation Jawbreaker, Gary Bernstein, the Joint Special Operations Command, and the CIA surrounded bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and he basically escaped into Pakistan because the United States didn't want to send reinforcements. What we need in this country is to get rid of the detrimental influences to our foreign policy, mainly the Pentagon, the Gulf lobby, and the Israeli lobby. These are the major influences to American foreign policy. And we're witnessing it today. And it's a problem because we're not stopping the enemy. We're creating new ones with our drone strikes, slaughtering civilians en masse by aiding Islamic groups like we did in Syria through a CIA program called Timber Sycamore, where we were funding Islamic groups to try and overthrow Bashar al Assad, just like what we did with the Mujahideen in 1979 in trying to overthrow the communist regime out of Afghanistan. They serve a purpose, and the purpose is the greater geopolitical goals of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States. And it needs to stop because our poor men and women of the U.S. military are getting killed for not just for spreading democracy. We're not spreading democracy, we're spreading terrorism under the thinly transparent veil of democracy. They're fighting for the wars of old men. They're fighting for the interests, foreign interests of Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, you don't need to be ex-military to be someone who's against the war. I was never in the military, and I'm anti-war. Doesn't mean I'm anti-American. I don't want to see anyone killed for the agendas of nefarious, deceitful, sociopathic individuals, whether it be from the left or right. The act is one in regards to certain policies. It needs to stop, and it needs to stop now, but it's not going to stop if the American people don't act as a singular unit and force them to stop. But I'm afraid it's a little bit too late because we're too divided and we're too inherently violent to one another. We're basically a violent country as it is, with all these mass shootings, crime rates in certain areas exponentially rising. And of course, that reflects to our government, which is the biggest terrorist group in the world, led by the foreign policy of the State Department, the Kingdom in Saudi Arabia, and the Zionists in Israel. These are the real enemies for true global hegemony. And we need more awareness. And I need you to become more outspoken.